You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 70. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I am your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite developers, authors, and speakers about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. We've decided not to have a sponsor for the podcast, but if you want to support the podcast and the kinds of things that I do, feel free to visit my Pluralsight courses at seanw.me/psauthor, including my newest course on building a web app with ASP.NET Core. We're finally done with our 25-city road trip, and we got a lot of great shows recorded, including today's show from New York City. In New York City, we interviewed Nick Landry. Nick Landry is a mobility pioneer and an expert specializing in the design and production of mobile applications for consumers and for the enterprise, using diverse cross-platform technologies, including Windows Phone, Windows 8, iOS, Android, mobile web, Xamarin, and PhoneGap. Nick is a Senior Technical Evangelist with Microsoft in the New York metro area and works with developers, students, and IT pros to help them learn, adopt, and use the Microsoft Developer Platform to design and build the next generation of apps for Windows Phone, Windows 8, and Windows Azure. Nick is also a Nokia Developer Ambassador whose mandate is to educate and support Windows Phone developers to maximize their success. Prior to joining Microsoft, Nick spent 2 years as a senior product manager for mobile data visualization and geospatial developer tools across multiple technologies and platforms. He previously spent most of his career in IT consulting and services organizations across various technical and business roles, designing, building, managing, and selling innovative software solutions for some of the world's top brands and Fortune 500 companies. Nick and I talked about how he got started, including the big change from living and working in Canada to moving to New York City. He's got a lot of lessons to share, and I think you're going to like this one. Let's take a listen. Well, welcome to New York City. This is really exciting. I came to New York City to do the code camp a few months ago, and we spent 5 hours in New York and had to turn around due to a family emergency. So we were a little afraid what was going to happen. I was actually born here in Manhattan.
Were you?
Many years ago. Many years ago. And,
no one asked how many.
We moved away from New York when I was about 6. They didn't ask me if I wanted to move. I would have stayed. And for years, I told people that I was born in Brooklyn. I was born and brought up in Brooklyn. I thought I was born in Brooklyn. This was like, I took a little pride of, yeah, I'm a Brooklyn boy. And about 2 years ago, my mother said, we never lived in Brooklyn. You were born in Manhattan. What? I've been lying for 40 some odd years about this? He said, yeah. You never asked me. I was there. So I'm really excited to be here. We're doing a little tourism while we're here. So we're going to go see Book of Mormon tomorrow night, me and my wife. Nice. And we should have a good time. And today on the show, I have the wonderful Nick Landry.
How you doing?
Good.
Thanks for having me.
I think the last time we saw each other, you weren't an employee yet.
No, I'm pretty sure that was probably MVP Summit some number of years ago. Back when
absolutely.
I would not even know where I used to work then. It was either Infusion or Infragistics. Those were the two companies where I worked back when I was an MVP.
Yeah,
so.
That's great. So you know sort of the story of the podcast. I'm curious how you got started, because you're, I mean, I don't mean this in any bad way, but you're Canadian.
Yes. Please don't hold it against me. But even worse than that, I'm French Canadian.
That's the worst kind, you know.
Unless you're building a hockey team, then that's the people you want.
I hear that.
So, but not me.
I mostly grew up in Florida.
Okay.
And so there are a lot of French Canadians who come and visit Florida.
Yes, not exactly the ones you want to see. No.
We used to say that at the speed they drive, it takes them 3 months to get to Quebec and then 3 months to drive back.
Pretty much. Yeah, it's funny growing up. That was kind of like the travel destination for a lot of people over there, to a point where there's certain parts of Florida that would kind of like dread the moment when the swarm of Quebecers would basically arrive. And I still remember there was a newspaper. I don't know how I ended up seeing a newspaper from Florida, but it had a very, very unflattering photo of some Quebecer in a Speedo with the beer gut out, wearing like an exposed cap and holding a camera. That was back in the 80s or 90s or something. And the headline, yeah, exactly. And the headline simply said, "They're back." So those are my people, you know.
Those are your people. I'm not going to say anything else about that because after living there for such a long time, I have a few stories, but not-nothing I'm willing to commit to tape.
Sure. It's funny we still call it tape.
We do. We do.
Even though there's no tape in there.
There is no tape in there. Just so you know. There's and I can see some of the young faces going, "What is tape?" So, did you have a computer growing up, or how did you start getting into computers?
So there's kind of, I would say, 3 influential computers in my past. So there's of course, the Commodore VIC-20.
Oh, the VIC-20.
Yeah, which I got, if I remember correctly, it was in around 82.
That's
something
about
like that.
Right. Yeah.
It was my stepdad actually had worked an event in LA or something like that. He was in television, and he was coming back from the event, and he had bought it in the United States because, of course, that kind of stuff did not exist in Canada.
Right.
Well, I'm sure it was, but you grow up in Canada, and everything always comes to the States first. It's always like, quote unquote, the States, and stuff goes there first. This is where all the cool stuff is, and eventually maybe it'll make it to us. So he brought back a Commodore VIC-20. And of course, I was mostly using it just for games.
Sure.
I had an Atari 2600, so I was playing games and everything. I was probably, 10 around that time? So,
yeah, probably. And the VIC-20 was called the VIC-20 because it had 22 characters across, was the text, which is the least I've ever tried to work with on a computer.
I was 22. Always told it was because there was 20 kilobytes of RAM.
No, there were only 3.5 kilobytes of RAM.
Well, there were basically 3.5 to 4 left after the operating system was booted. That's the thing. It had 20 Ks of RAM, but then once the operating system was booted, and of course by 16 Ks is a very lightweight OS, you only had about 4 Ks left to build with. But I don't know. We'll have to dig it around. I'm sure there's somebody listening to the podcast right now
that is yelling at their...
Yeah, digging in Wikipedia and yelling at us, so... Yeah. Maybe we'll know.
We will know. I'm positive.
We'll read the comment section afterwards. somebody's gonna debunk the story.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I was basically I tried programming a little bit. I didn't really get it too much. I did the 10th print Nick. 20 go to 10 hello, and then run. Yeah. And then it's like Nick everywhere on screen. And I tried different variants like hello Nick or Nicholas, which is my full name.
And curse words.
Actually, I don't think I did that one. I think I was pretty a good boy.
Because I'm a little fascinated with, I hear stories about the French-Canadian curse words.
Oh, yes. So my colleague Adam Tolliper from California, he is utterly fascinated with the notion of how Quebec came up with its curse words, because all of our curse words are basically based on religious artifacts.
Right.
So they're basically all the accessories that you would find in a Catholic church. And I'm not going to start naming that stuff, but it's basically, we've turned them all into curse words.
Wow.
Don't ask me who started it. I don't know if it was
strangest thing I've ever
rebellion
heard.
Against the church or something. But
Probably,
it was kind of pretty much all of the curse words in Quebec are based on religious items.
Wow. That's cool. And you said there were 2 other machines that were...
Yeah. So every few months, or maybe once or twice a year, I would go to my godparents' place, and they were basically family friends. But their son, I called my cousin. He was just a little younger than me. We would play together the whole weekend, and then my godfather got a Macintosh.
Oh, wow.
In '84. So at that point, I was around 12. So I discovered the Macintosh, the mouse and the graphic screen and everything. And my cousin was not a big fan of the computer, and he would just curse at me the entire weekend because at that age, after that, I was like, you know what? I just want to come and play with the computer. I didn't want to play with him anymore. We were not building Legos anymore and stuff like that, or playing secret agents or stuff like that. I was just playing on a computer. So I think he built like a resentment for computers after that, because his best friend, had abandoned him for a Mac.
We've all been there.
And a Mac of all things, But then my real computer was in 87. I had saved up a lot of money to actually buy my own computer. It was a Tandy 1000EX. It was an IBM PC compatible computer, but it was much faster than the IBM PC, because the IBM PC was clocked at 4.77 megahertz, and mine was going to 7.16 megahertz. You know that you're really scraping for megahertz when you're counting decimals.
You are.
So.
And did it have a turbo button?
No, this one did not have the turbo button. It was actually. Maybe it did. I don't know. I'm trying to remember if it did. I don't think so. This one was clocked at 716. It came with 256 Ks of RAM.
Wow. That's a beefy machine at the time.
Double density, floppy drive, 5.25. Over time, I saved more money to buy upgrades. So I eventually got the RAM to 640. Which is, apparently, I had heard, what nobody would ever need more than that.
No. That's apparently all I run now.
So somebody famous said that. And then I got my 3.5 drive. Never got a hard drive on that machine, though. That's something that was available, but that was way too expensive for me.
Crazy.
So yeah, I paid $1,500 Canadian for that first machine. Basically, all my savings from elementary school.
And that's like $25,000, right? I don't know the conversion.
No. I mean, no, 15. Back then, it was probably around maybe 1,000 to 1,200 US, and mine cost me about 1,500 Canadian.
Oh, nice.
So, but for a 15-year-old. In 1987.
That's a lot of money.
That was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And then I just poured myself into that computer.
Wow.
My first real operating system, you can say, was Microsoft DOS 2.11. And then
that was a good OS.
I pirated every bit of software under the sun, like any other teenager at the time. Played games. Learned a little bit of programming. Not too much programming.
So did you go to these... when I was a kid, we would go to these parties where we would go and hang out with our computer friends, but our parents never knew what it was like. Why do you need to bring all your discs? Because we were all copying them, because the one friend had had 2 drives.
Right.
So you put one
I never actually carried my computer with me for that. But I would, of course, bring boxes of floppies with me.
Right.
So that we could do like an exchange, And, and I had like piles and piles of floppies. So that was my first real computer, the one that really started the whole love affair, where I really became kind of like the computer whiz, at the time.
And were you programming, or were you doing more like the IT sort of stuff when you say becoming a computer whiz?
It was more, I was more like hacking around, working with, what was it called, that software that you could, with a hex editor in there. There was PC Utilities, and there was something like that.
Anyways, Norton Utilities, I think.
Anyway, so I basically got caught in school because in my last year there, we had a computer class. Actually, no, this was actually in the French class.
Oh.
Which is the main one, kind of like English, here. And the teacher had been so excited because he was like, we got this new French software and it's going to teach us, to help you basically write stuff and correct you and blah, blah, blah. And he'd been talking about it for weeks. And again, you have to remember, this was 1988 at this point, so computers were not really a big thing yet.
No.
And
not in schools, at least.
And I was prepared for that day, the day that we would go to the computer lab and play with the French software. Because while people were playing on the software, I was playing in the software. I basically brought my hex editor, and then I started hacking away at all the hex code that was in there, and I was finding all the plain text strings and replacing them with maybe some of those curse words we were talking about earlier. And as luck would have it, because of course there was no network back then, they had to make copies of the disk, to copy around the lab for the future classes and everything. It just so happened that my copy that I was using in my computer was the one that was used as a master to create more copies for upcoming classes after that. And then after that, they ended up a bunch of students showed up at the computer class for the French class and at the computer lab. And now the software is basically insulting them left and right and things like. So I got in trouble. Of course, back then the teachers were all looking at this dumbfounded, like, what, how did he do it?
Yeah.
Nobody understood that. Even the computer class teacher himself was just, how unions are, right? They don't necessarily pick people based on qualifications. It's always usually who has the seniority and everything. So the guy that was teaching a computer class, he was the first one to say, like, I'm not a computer teacher.
Sure.
And there was a lot of things that he just didn't know how to do. I remember one day he came to me and he gives me a disk and he goes, there's a few files on this disk that need to be renamed to something else. He said, can you take it home and rename that? And I'm like, I can do it right now if you want, You've never learned like REN on DOS, So, yeah, none of these people knew how this stuff works. So I think in the end, I didn't really get into trouble because they were like, you know what? He's probably smart.
And we probably need him.
let's not punish him for that. So I ended up winning an award at the end of the year and at graduation. At the end of high school, they basically gave like the teacher's prize in each of the teacher's prize in math and French and physics and chemistry. And I got the teacher's prize in computer class.
Wow. That's awesome.
Being the first hacker in that school. So yeah, so that computer was great. Sadly, 6 years ago, my parents moved and that computer was still in storage up there in Canada.
Wow.
And they were downsizing. So I had to get rid of a lot of stuff.
Wow.
And I remember vividly the image of taking that computer and hundreds of disks and throwing them in the dumpster.
Wow.
I was living in an apartment then,
sure.
Still in Jersey City. I didn't have any room for it. And then 2 months later, my wife got a new job. We moved deeper into Jersey and we bought a house.
Wow.
And I was like, if I had known this 2 months before, I could have kept my computer. And my wife is very happy, of course, that I didn't get to keep it because every time she walks into my home office, my heart rate just climbs a little higher because she takes a look around and I know that she's thinking like, what could I ask him to throw out today, or something like that.
It's true. I'm that person in my marriage as I go in and go, why do we still have that broken stained glass in the corner? Should we get rid of that? And she's like, it was my grandfather's in his store. And
see, I can understand that. You nostalgia and nostalgia can come in equipment that you used to plug on a wall or something
Absolutely.
like that. So it's
absolutely. I didn't ever have my original machines growing up because I was always trading them up, right? I'd give someone a couple $100 on my VIC-20 so I could get a Commodore 64. So I never really had the original ones. And then in my 20s, or I guess my 30s. Yeah, it would have to be my 30s because eBay existed. Yeah. That just dates everything. I went and bought all those original machines again so I could have them.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And I don't have them any longer, but at the time I was like, I'm just going to create a little shrine in the basement and they'll all be working.
We all have the same ideas.
Yeah. It was crazy. And the guy who I bought the Commodore 64 from loved this machine. You could tell he was original owner. He had it for 18 years or something at that point. And so he sent me the Commodore and the Daisy wheel printer, if anyone remembers what that is.
Yes.
And a floppy drive. And then a year and a half later, a box arrived at my house because he had found more software. And he was like, I want to keep it together. I'm going to keep it together.
Nice.
Yeah. So we all have those interesting attachments.
I still have the VIC-20 though.
Oh, wow.
That I still have. I have not powered this in over 30 years. I almost did a few months ago, but then we moved recently. So then I started packing my stuff again. So I'll have to get it out of the box and see if it still works. I would love to see that.
Yeah.
And then as for the Mac, it was a year or two ago. My cousin contacts me and, they still had it. And then he was asking me, could I sell it? How much is it worth? And I was like, you know what? I said, that computer I have is a very, very strong emotional attachment for me. So I said, if you're not going to sell it or something, you could send it my way. But he didn't get the message. It's like it didn't really ring through to him that, I built an entire career on this and this computer.
Was he still upset with you?
He was probably still upset at the fact that I ditched him all these weekends, to play with the Mac and play winter games on it.
Oh, winter game. I think I remember breaking my friend's Commodore 64 because of winter games. Because to do one of them, you had to go back and forth between two of the keys.
Right. A lot of those things were like that. Yeah.
And I had destroy Shrek-sized hands even then, and so I'd be trying to compete with him, and then two keys flew off the He was not very happy.
Yeah.
I was just glad it was his, not mine. I'll be honest. So when did you start in software? Did this give you sort of that bug that you wanted to go to college and all that? Or?
Well, actually, I experimented a lot with programming a little bit here and there, but not really seriously.
Like GW Basic and those sort of things that were on the
so
machine?
I did some GW Basic. I originally was supposed to go to med school. Because even before I discovered computers, I had decided I wanted to become a neurosurgeon. Go figure. And then after high school, because in Quebec, you basically, you have 5 years of high school, not 6. Like here, if you include like what you call like junior high and high school together, you get 6 years. Over there, it's 5. You get 2 years of cégep, which is a general degree. And then you go to university. So cégep is like college for us. So college and university are not the same thing. So I went to college in health sciences on a 2-year program. And then halfway through, that's when people kept asking me, like, why'd you want to become a doctor? You're so good with computers and everything. Right. And then I asked myself, why do I want to become a doctor?
Is that when you figured out that brains don't actually have registers and you can't with assembly?
There was kind of a light bulb at some point. I kind of had like a flash of seeing like the hallway of a hospital and then hear an intercom that says like, Dr. Landry requested in room 302 or something. And then I was like, nah. This is not what I want to do, you know? Fortunately, with a science program, you can pretty much do anything. So I then decided to finish the health sciences and then decided instead for university, I would apply for computer engineering.
Nice.
So at this point, I had already taken some classes in college. I'd done a Pascal class. So just to get started with it. Then started university in computer engineering, did more Pascal. After the first semester, I was already a TA on that class.
Nice. I like calling Pascal C# 0.1. I think that's about right.
Oh man, no, C# is way better. I don't miss Pascal. And so I started programming here pretty much a lot more at this point. And then I did some GW Basic a little bit more. But then what happened during those years is I was working in a computer store.
Oh, okay.
And then it was called CompuCenter in a mall. I was selling calculators and Nintendo Entertainment Systems and PS2s and Macs sometimes, although most people didn't buy them because they were too expensive.
So sort of like a Best Buy sort of?
Much smaller. It was a chain, basically. It's a chain across Canada, but much, much smaller stores. There was not really a notion of super stores like this back in the day. Especially computer stores, there was not enough volume to have something so big. So, but yeah, I worked there for about 3.5 years part-time while I was studying. And the key part here of the story is that Microsoft, so at this point we're probably in 1990 maybe, Microsoft had an employee purchase plan.
Oh, really?
An employee purchase program where...
So you could buy employees.
I could buy... we could buy Microsoft software, heavily discounted Microsoft software.
Nice.
So I was paid $5.25 an hour, and I spent $300 in Microsoft software back in 1990 to get the original version of Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and then Quick C, Quick Pascal, Quick Basic, Quick Assembler, Flight Simulator, of course.
And those were all worth it because the amount of books you got with them, right?
Oh yeah, those were massive. The boxes were huge.
I remember, I think it was Quick Basic came with about 2 feet of books. The width of the box was like this big.
It was huge, yeah.
With because every API was documented in a physical book.
Well, there was no internet.
No.
That's what people have to remember. There was no internet then. Your docs were actual docs.
Yeah.
And books were way, way too large to put on discs.
Yeah.
So that's why you expected to get a physical book.
Yeah.
So I still remember traveling to downtown Montreal to the Microsoft office there. Walking in, I was still a kid at this point. I was not even 20. And then brought my little form with my check. And a few weeks later, got all my big software and everything. So got my first version of PowerPoint then. That was interesting in 1990. I played mostly with Flight Simulator. The funny thing, though, is that...
Were these the DOS versions?
Those were the DOS versions. Oh, but I did have also Windows 286 and Windows 386,
Oh,
which
so you
is
learned
basically
Solitaire.
Windows 2.0, basically.
Right.
It's Windows, because Windows 1 was just like the 286 version, if you
Right.
will. And then Windows 2 had two versions, the 286 and the 386
For
version.
the different processors.
Yes. So, unfortunately, then I didn't have a 286 yet. So I bought them, but I couldn't use them yet. But later I did get another computer, but then at this point we were already on Windows 3. So anyway.
Yeah.
Not sure if I still have those boxes somewhere. That would be pretty cool. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah.
Especially considering where I work now. And anyway, so bottom line is, a few years later, when I was in college, I got an interview for an engineering firm for a summer job. And of course, you know how it is when you're young. You basically put anything you can scratch, basically scrape around on your resume to kind of fill it up because you have nothing. You're young,
So you had PowerPoint on your resume.
So I basically all the software that were on my shelf, including those Microsoft software, were on my resume. And then the guy looks at this and he goes, "Oh, Quick Basic." He said, "That's cool." I said, "We actually use that a lot here. There was the QBX, the Quick Basic Professional Development System." He said, "You know that? That's interesting." And I'm like, "Shit! I hope he doesn't ask me any questions because I've done GW Basic, but I'd never actually used Quick Basic.
Right.
It was on my shelf, but I didn't use it." So he goes, "Oh, that's pretty cool. Yeah." So I get the job.
Wow.
And that night, I installed Quick Basic. And I spent the weekend coding a lot in Quick Basic. And then I started working there, and then they had additional libraries to do like menus and mouse control and everything in DOS. And then that summer, one morning, I come in, and he grabs me, and he goes like, he's so excited. He goes, at this point, we're in 1992. And he tells me, "I got this software that I bought a few months ago. I only tried it last night for the first time." He said, "It's unbelievable for development. You'll never believe this." He said, "It's called Visual Basic." And that was Visual Basic 1.
Yeah.
So we immediately switched all of our projects from Quick Basic on DOS to Visual Basic on Windows.
This was Windows 3X, right?
At this point, we were at Windows 3.11.
3.11.
Remember Windows for Workgroups?
Uh-huh.
So, so basically, I started learning Visual Basic. I just caught on just like that.
Sure.
With it. My boss was kind of struggling with it. He was still thinking like procedural programming, the way that the Quick Basic and Pascal were working and everything. But the whole event-driven model, it just clicked with me.
Sure.
And drag and drop visual design and everything. There weren't objects yet.
Well, especially the buttons clicked with you, I think.
Oh, and of course, yeah, especially since back then, trust me, you needed a lot of imagination to see where that was going to go because Visual Basic 1, first of all, didn't even have like a background. It was a bunch of floating windows you could see your Windows desktop through it.
Just sort of that frame of...
It was basically, there was one box for the frame with the menu at the top. Your property window was a separate window. Your toolbox was a separate window. Your project was a separate window. Your form was a separate window. They just forgot to put like the all-encapsulating window around everything. So you could see everything.
They're still working on MDA.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, MDA, multiple document windows did not exist yet. And then... So I learned that. I got it I basically caught on very fast on it. At the end of the summer, I was supposed to go back to school.
Sure.
My boss, I had kept like a week off in between like the end of my summer job and going back just so I could rest a little. He kept eating away at my week.
Sure.
He said, "No, you gotta come back. You gotta come back. You're really good at this and you're much faster than I am and everything." And then I remember one night we're at Burger King, and it was supposed to be my last day. I was supposed to go back to school after that, and there was only one day left after that, so I could just like unwind, gather my stuff before I go back to school. And he goes, "You got to come back tomorrow." I'm like, "Come on, Norman. I mean, I got to go back to school and I'd like to have one day off." He said, if you come back to work tomorrow, I will pay you a full week. I was like, oh man.
And were you still making $5.25 an hour?
No, at this point, At this point, I was paid much more. But well, of course, much more. Yeah. We're still talking 1992 here.
Yeah.
So I did, and he did.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So that's how my whole love affair started with Visual Basic, and then after that, I just kept on working on every version since. So
it was really you and Norman in this early version. So it's just the two of you sort of trying to learn from each other?
Pretty much, yeah, because he didn't have any formal training. I only had like 1 year of college at that point when I was doing that internship. I kept working there part-time for a while until I eventually joined full-time. And then... so it was basically I was there. So, and the funny thing is the system I was working on, you know how most people, whenever they build their first software, it's something that's going to be like Hello World, or a tip calculator or something like that. The software I was working on was computer assisted engineering to design power lines. Wow. So it was a contract that we were doing for the power company in Quebec, Hydro-Quebec. And this was a software that would help engineers to design a power line. Wow. And I had designed I did 4 versions of that software over the years I worked there. And the last version, it was almost like an Excel-style grid. Sure. Where you would have a toolbox, and on the toolbox was pylons. It all been influenced by the VB design. Sure. And you could drag and drop pylons in the list and then configure like all of the parameters in there and everything. At the end, this would go and produce like piles and piles and piles of printed paper with the list of equipment, all the metal that was required, all the way down to how much cable was. I was calculating like the cabling between the pylons, including the sway and the cable and everything. How much excavation would have to be done around each pylon? How much dirt would come out of this? How many trucks would be required to get the dirt out? That's crazy. All the way down to the fencing for the cows around the pylons and everything. And once it produced everything, it also produced a list of which AutoCAD drawings to pull out of the system, and they could just take the pile of reports, the AutoCAD drawings, give that to a contractor, and they would go build a power line. Wow. And I built the whole thing in VB 1 through 3. Wow. That's crazy. So, and you were able to get that all to work in 16-bit. That I think impresses me even more. Oh, yeah. I kept pushing the limits of Visual Basic, but that environment was and still is completely unbelievable. That's crazy. So I owe a lot to VB. So at some point, did you move to a place where you were working in more teams than that? Because it sounds like you were. It took a while. It took a while. By the end, before I left there were a couple more people that joined, but I was still kind of like the main developer in there. There were a couple of more junior people that had joined. Then I went on to. I left there. And I went on to work in technically my first startup. I was not an owner of the startup, but I was employee number 1 in the startup. That was my second job. And one of the other guys that came eventually in the startup a few months later was one of your future guests, Mario Cardinal. Oh, Mario. So Mario and I worked together back in the 90s, and we were doing electronic document management systems. Wow. And this was just about the time that the internet was starting to take off. And most of our systems were fax-based. Like electronic fax. Yes. Well, we're not using papers anymore, but it was still scanning and everything. So, unfortunately, the company kind of ran out of money in 10 months. So I found myself out of work. Happened. But then after that, I joined a proper consulting firm where now we had like a lot of people on staff and a lot of developers. I immediately was kind of like named like technical lead in that company, thanks to all the stuff that I had been doing before. But that's where I got to work on a lot more bigger systems with teams and everything in the 90s. And where do you sort of sit when you're working in a team and how that's different from sort of the individual developer? Because that was a hill that I felt like was sort of important for me to climb at some point in my career. Actually, what's funny is that when I joined a team, my first role was basically architect. Architecture did not really exist back then. At this point, at that startup, I'd already discovered component-based development with VB4. Remember remote automation in VB4? No, but that moment when I was sitting at one computer and I had the client software here and I had my little like Ole remote automation, based on object linking and embedding running on that other computer. And I had a UI on it. You're not supposed to have a UI on a server, but I still put one because you need to see something. And when I pushed that button and then I saw that window on the other computer show up, again, another light bulb. Immediately I understood, holy crap, distributed computing. Yeah. This is going to change the world. Yeah. So that's when I learned that there's not just client-server architecture and mainframe architecture. There was a whole bunch of new architectures that could come up. So it started with 3-tier, it became N-tier, and all distributed systems and everything. So in that consulting firm, they had a big project for the gas company. And I ended up designing the very first 3-tier software in Montreal based on Microsoft technologies. That was before Microsoft even had anything for 3-tier.
Well, before all the DNA stuff.
Oh, well, that's like 4 years before Windows DNA, especially since at the moment we went into deployment, I started hearing some rumors from the Microsoft office about some secret project. It was called Viper, which became Microsoft Transaction Server. So that was basically their first foray into like middleware with basically for distributed transactions and object pooling and everything. I wrote my own object pooling and connection manager for Oracle, especially since back then licensing had not caught up yet. So the licenses were still tied to actual keys. They were not CALs. They were basically just like connection licenses or whatever, because they assume that X number of users are going to need X number of connections because client server, you keep the connection open all the time. Right. So I wrote a connection manager that would run on the middle tier. And then that connection manager would pull a whole bunch of connections to Oracle, and as you would instantiate objects on the server, it would then take a connection from the pool, plug it into that object, serve the object back to the client. So you could have a team of 50 people and only maybe 5 or 10 connections to Oracle. Wow. So they were saving a ton of money this way because legally speaking, based on the licensing, it was fine. Of course, that changed later.
Yes, they caught up pretty quick.
But and of course, because instead of keeping the connection live, the moment you would press the save button, that's when I would instantiate the objects, get the connection, and then as soon as you were done, I would release everything. So I rolled the whole thing.
It's interesting because that sort of strategy, which ended up being what you needed to do to scale, you were doing for money.
No, I did it for scaling as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah. The whole point was basically to scale as well. Because when they walked me through the project, I asked, have you guys considered a 3-tier architecture for this? And they were like, what's 3-tier and what's architecture? So then I started explaining it to them, and then they're
so when they said what's architecture, you didn't leave? You just didn't walk out of the meeting?
No, because remember we're in 1996. Yeah, software architecture did not exist yet. Sure. That was not a title. Yeah, that was not a thing. You were a programmer or a developer, but a software architect did not exist yet. Yeah. So I basically became the first architect in the company. And I immediately became like the technical lead, for all of these efforts. And they were like, how do we do this? And I said, I'll teach you. Yeah. So I ended up basically taking the technical leadership of the team, and everybody got technically stronger thanks to like the new things that I brought in for them. And it was great. So that's why basically I never was really like I would say a developer in the trenches alongside other developers. Sure. Because the moment I graduated to a team, I immediately became an architect.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. If you look back at your career, are there any decisions that you would make differently knowing what you know today?
How long do you have left on this podcast? Because there could be quite a few. You know what? I try not to look too much of those. Sure. Because, I endorsed beta over VHS, and I was really hoping HD DVD would win over Blu-ray.
I would have never admitted HD DVD, even though I owned one.
And let's not talk about any inception of Windows Mobile. But
especially not right now.
Yeah. So the bottom line is I like to look at the stuff that I've done right instead. Because what's interesting is I can connect the dots on some things that I kind of didn't really see before. Like, for example, that project that I did in 3-tier got us noticed by the Microsoft office in Montreal. When the corp office, the RD program that was just like a year old at that point, when they wanted to expand and get more RDs across the world, they then reached out to the Montreal office, and long story short, I basically ended up becoming the first RD in Montreal thanks to that project.
Yeah, I bet.
And then being an RD immediately introduced me to 120 other RDs who were all speakers at events. And I started doing some seminars in that company doing web development using active server pages, also known as classic ASP today. But back then it was just called ASP. So I basically fell in love with public speaking. Sure. These other RDs invited me to events. We were doing dev days for the RD program back then. I started doing web development. And the way I try to explain it to people now is I try to help developers catch the new wave, not wait until things are kind of settled down. So that's where in 1996, when the internet was just still emerging, like becoming bigger and bigger, and we were still building client server software, some 3-tier, but it was always like a fat client that we were writing for. And then I started telling developers, we should build web applications. You should learn this active server pages. You should learn HTML. And back then, of course, we had a choice of JavaScript or VB script on the client. I love VB script.
You're the one.
Yeah, that's me. I owe everything to VB.
I hear that.
So I was telling developers back when we were writing fat clients, I was telling them, you should learn web development because this is going to go somewhere.
Yeah.
Just like in 2002, I started telling developers, you should learn mobile development because that's going to go somewhere. That's 5 years before the iPhone came out.
Right.
And that's why 2 years ago, I started telling developers to get into IoT. Because that's going to be another big wave that's already started and that's exploding. And you can either get in once everything is saturated and everybody's established and you're going to have a hard time making your mark.
Sure.
Or you can get in early and be a pioneer, just like I did with web development in the 90s and mobility in 2002. And now, just recently, I started doing some sessions on even virtual reality and mixed reality.
Sure.
And in fact, all the people here, just shameless plug, you should come back next Wednesday because at the meetup, I'll be doing a session on HoloLens and VR.
Nice.
So, well, both mixed reality and virtual reality. So I've basically built a career as a speaker of trying to help developers become more than themselves, just like I had done with that team that didn't know about 3-tier.
Sure.
And a few months later, we were deploying a system, and they were the ones who had built it, in 3-tier. I wrote the middleware part, those components, I wrote them, but all the client-side stuff that was talking to it and everything, and they understood how it worked.
Sure.
So it's all about helping developers become better. So I guess it's kind of predestined to become an evangelist in the end, because that's the best part about my job, is helping developers really become more than what they are today. I love to ask developers if they have their dream job, because I have my dream job.
That's awesome.
And if someone says, I don't have my dream job, my question is, why not?
Right.
What are you doing about it? What are you learning? What's missing for you to get your dream job? So
that's great.
So that's why I try not to dwell too much on the stuff the decisions that were, I did have a Commodore CD-TV. Ever heard of this one?
I have heard of it. I've never seen one.
I had one of those. I think it got lost somewhere or whatever. In terms of regrets, there's some, but let's not go there. That's fine. Because you know what? In the end, all the pieces fell together so well in my career that if one of the decisions I regretted had been changed, maybe something else would not have happened.
Sure.
And maybe I would still be like living single in Canada instead of being happily married with a family and a great career here in the U.S. So
that's great to hear. That really is. Well, thanks so much for being on the podcast.
My pleasure. Hopefully I didn't ramble on too much.
Not at all.
It's basically an entire podcast base that starts with back in my day.
It is. I almost called this the Old Man podcast at one point because, or Get Off My Lawn. Those were both almost the name of the podcast. And look, I don't think anyone's asleep, so I think you did a pretty good job.
Hopefully, yeah. So
let's give him a big hand.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast. Remember, you can subscribe